European Union foreign ministers meet to discuss the Red Sea crisis, the war on Gaza and Ukraine. There's unity on some issues, but sharp division on others. Is it possible for the bloc of 27 states to have a shared or meaningful foreign policy? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Israel's war on Gaza has laid bare sharp divisions within the European Union, in contrast to the near unity and swift, extensive action taken against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Born back in 1957 as a trading club of 6 nations, the old EEC has grown into the 27-member European Union that we know today. Trade is now just one part of the EU's business, with foreign policy and military action core areas for cooperation too. But some might say they're often the cause too of disagreement, with divergent views and competing national interests. Seeking consensus can mean delays and a watered-down final position. Critics say this weakens the EU's global influence compared to, say, the US or China. So can the EU have a cohesive foreign policy? Does its present structure need to change to enable that? Or could such a change ever even be agreed? We'll be discussing all this and more with our guests in just a few moments. But first, Malchabe Motsepe reports on unity and division in the EU.
European Union foreign ministers are in Brussels with Gaza and Ukraine on their agenda. They are also hoping to reach consensus on how to protect ships from Houthi attack in the Red Sea, and to what extent naval forces from EU members might become involved. It's been weeks since the group that governs most of Yemen started targeting vessels passing through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most important shipping routes. The Houthis say their attacks are in response to Israel's 3-month-long military offensive in Gaza. The attacks are disrupting world trade, forcing shipping companies to reroute vessels to take much longer voyages around the southern tip of Africa.
The Yemeni armed forces emphasizes that the response to the American and British offenses is inevitably coming, and any new offense will not remain without a response and punishment. The Yemeni armed forces assures that the navigation in both Arabian and Red Seas will continue to all destinations around the world, except the ports of occupied Palestine.
The US has set up a multinational force, but with limited EU involvement. There's disagreement within the EU. Germany, Italy and France wanting to send warships to the Red Sea, but other EU members fear becoming involved in what could become a wider regional war. There are deep EU divisions over Israel's war on Gaza. The president of the EU Commission was criticized for her visit to Tel Aviv at the start of the war, when she claimed to speak for the whole Union in support of Israel. Germany and other states have supported Israel, but other members such as Spain and Belgium have been highly critical and long demanded a ceasefire.
This war cannot be solved with weapons. Since October 7th, nearly 25,000 people have lost their lives. Gaza is in an extremely urgent situation. There's a risk of famine and disease. The fighting needs to stop.
The EU's divisions over Israel's Gaza war contrast with swift agreements on action against Russia for invading Ukraine. But Hungary blocked a Ukrainian funding package and has been backed by Slovakia in demanding EU policy changes. So with veto powers for member states and 27 different governments involved, the EU structure can make finding consensus a complex and at times elusive task. Malchabe Motsepe, Al Jazeera, Inside Story.
Oh, well, let's now go to our guests. First up, Suzanne Lynch. She's the Politico news organization's chief Brussels correspondent. She joins us now from there. In Barcelona, we have Julien Barnes-Dacey, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Berlin, we have Ben Aris, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, a business media company focusing on emerging markets. Thanks so much for joining us all on Inside Story. Now, when it comes to the war on Gaza, we know there have been deep divisions, as we've just been reporting. But that division is over a ceasefire. It seems from what we're hearing in Brussels, there is now some unity over what may happen the so-called day after. Even Germany, now a staunch supporter of Israel from the beginning, is speaking about a two-state solution. So we're talking about a monthly meeting of EU foreign ministers, but they do have some special guests this month, I see, and there's ostensibly some kind of draft roadmap to peace that's going to be discussed. Julien, is the EU fighting for relevance here, or has what's happened in the Red Sea over the last little while, has that perhaps lit a fire under some EU leaders, do you think?
Well, I think the crisis in Gaza has really exposed the sense of European irrelevance and weakness in the Middle East, at least. There's obviously a lot else happening in the world, and a lot of places where questions are asked about how important and how relevant Europeans are. But suddenly what's happening in the Middle East, in the Gaza war, the Europeans have very much been at the bottom of the ladder in terms of importance. It's the Arab states, it's Iran, it's Israel, it's the US. And then some way behind it, the Europeans, who don't really have a position and they don't really bring much to the table. So there are a lot of questions being asked, and I would question somewhat the sense of new coherence behind a two-state solution track. I mean, that's something they've all symbolically said for months, for years. The question is, will they do anything to push it in that direction? What are they prepared to leverage in terms of their relations with the Palestinians, with the Israelis, with the Arab states? And there are huge divisions underlying that still. So there's a long way to go before we really talk about a coherent European position here.
Oh, it certainly sounds like it. Well, just looking briefly before we move on to the broader situation in Gaza, I want to focus a little bit on what's happening in the Red Sea. Now, the Houthis there have said their actions in the Red Sea are a direct consequence of the war on Gaza. But are EU foreign ministers actually making that link? From the sounds of things, Ben, it does feel like they're being treated almost as separate issues.
Separate issues. I think they're definitely linked. The Houthis have been closing down and taking sides, targeting Israeli ships. But at the same time, they're letting Chinese and Russian ships go through. And, you know, to my mind, this is a long-standing dispute and rivalry or bad relations between the Houthis and the Israelis. But, I mean, it's also getting caught up in the wider conflict that we have in Europe. With the showdown between Russia and the West, China's involved in that as well. And to that extent, they have been accused of playing sides, of being used as a tool, a wider tool in Putin's campaign against the states. So the situation is getting rapidly more complicated as all these factors come in.
Well, let me bring in Suzanne here. Suzanne, do you think that what's happening in the Red Sea is perhaps an opportunity to find some kind of European unity then on maritime issues when they are so divided on other things?
I think the issue in the Red Sea is actually more contentious because within the EU, you've got certain member states who have a very strong military presence, a very strong defence identity, and you've others who are neutral, who are not members of NATO. So they are certainly not going to want to get involved in anything that they feel is too military, that might escalate the situation. So yes, it's part of the discussion that's happening just across the road from me here in Brussels today about some kind of an EU mission in the Red Sea. France, Germany and Italy, the three biggest countries, are spearheading that. But they already, you know, as their own countries, they already have a strong presence there. We've had Belgium said it's going to kind of add, tack along to that as well. But the discussion is going to be about making this part of an existing mission rather than starting a whole new initiative in the Red Sea. I don't think there's going to be an appetite for that at EU level. It's not what the EU is about, really. You know, that's kind of more the job of NATO or a military alliance. So I think that is going to be controversial, even though, as you say there, it is on the agenda. So let's see if Italy, France and Germany get sufficient buy-in for that from other EU countries today.
So just to be clear, that the naval mission that we're talking about here is separate from the US-led naval mission that's already taking place in the Red Sea. That's Operation Prosperity Guardian. That was a US-led mission, but even though a number of EU members did sign up to Operation Prosperity Guardian, it felt like very few, if any, actually deployed. I've been wondering, Ben, was this a capacity issue for the EU, or was it a political one? Was this about perhaps US leadership?
But we should cycle back a little bit. I mean, you said in your preamble the EU is set up as a trade club, and essentially it remains that. There is no sort of EU government per se. I mean, you have people like Joseph Borrell, who's nominally the foreign minister, but the EU's mandate is only to make foreign policy as far as trade is concerned. So the system works extremely well when things are going well and everyone's making money. However, when we come to crises like this, then there isn't actually there's no European army, there's no EU army. And so at the end of the day, the member states, they make a sovereign decision to get involved militarily. And in this case, what they like to do is try and act in unison and act and represent the EU. But at the end of the day, it's a collection of individual countries making this decision. And as we saw with the US-led military initiative to try and bring the fighting to an end, I mean, people are coming in ad hoc at the level of each nation. And so we have a very confused situation here. And I think what will end up happening is individual countries, powerful military ones like Germany, may send forces, and they would like to do it in cooperation with the rest of the EU because they see themselves as a club. But it's not a government. It's not a government that can make a decision like everybody has to contribute 100 ships or 200 soldiers or whatever it is to send them. And so what we're seeing in Brussels now is this discussion where sovereigns have made up their mind and they're trying to coordinate with their friends in the EU and then do something with a collective front. But you'll see only certain countries actually actively participating, and each country has a different view, a different level of enthusiasm for this.
Well, as I understand it, the document around this mission that's been floating around Brussels, it proposes sending, and I'm quoting here, at least 3 warships with multi-mission capabilities, and that could happen as early as next month. We've been talking about some of the countries who've been saying they might deploy. My understanding is that those countries might then cycle through. You might have other countries then sending in other ships, and then those other countries pulling their ships out. Julien, what should we make of all of this? Is this all being primarily driven by economic concerns?
Absolutely. I think here in what's happening in the Red Sea, it's about the maritime shipping routes. It's about keeping them open. There is obviously a concern and a fear that if the Houthis do manage to keep those permanently closed, that will have a knock-on inflationary effect on Europe. So that's what's driving this here. The nature of how it's playing out, I think, is driven by some of the concerns laid out by Ben and Suzanne. But I think, fundamentally, the Europeans want to do some kind of monitoring mission here that pushes the Houthis back. I don't think their real desire is to get engaged with the same kind of military offensive dimension that the Americans have pushed for here. And I think that's one of the key divisions as well. And we saw that in the Persian Gulf a couple of years ago after Iranian attacks as well. The Europeans believe that they can take a more middle ground position that allows them to keep the space open but doesn't risk drawing them into the same level of conflict that the Americans are now embarking on amid a broader regional conflict where obviously there's a lot of concern about the dangers of this spiraling out of control.
Of course. Well, Suzanne, then let me ask you, do you have a sense of if the US at all was in consultation with its EU allies before deciding to take those strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen? Obviously, there have been huge concerns about escalation, and the EU is directly involved, given the geography and the Suez Canal. What conversations are going on right now between Washington and Brussels?
Yeah, I think there are definitely conversations going on, particularly between national capitals of those big countries we mentioned who have already sent, military help. So France, Germany, Italy, the G7 countries, and then NATO, which is also based here in Brussels, but not all EU member states. Most of them, but not all, are members of NATO. There are conversations happening there as well. So yes, there are conversations going on about this, but the EU, as has been said already, the EU as a bloc is not going to decide to send a military mission into the Red Sea because certain countries are going to block that. The neutral countries are going to block that. They don't want to escalate the situation. But, as you say here, there will be a willingness by some countries to go that bit further. And you're right. I mean, the geography here is interesting. The EU is right beside this. But economically, it is affecting all of the West, different countries, including the US. But I do think that the US perspective here is very much weighing on opinion here in Brussels. And that's because there's a growing frustration among a number of countries. The US is not doing enough to persuade Israel to stop the offensive on Gaza. It's as simple as that. And it is significant that today we have the Israeli foreign minister here in Brussels. We're also going to have a senior Palestinian. They're not going to meet. But we also have the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Egypt. That is very unusual to have that mixture of people here today. So it's showing that the EU does want to shape events, even though it's not going to come forward with this huge military capability. It feels that it does, among its 27, its collective weight, that it can try and politically bring some pressure, particularly on Israel, to maybe restrain a bit more. I think there's been a lot of consternation about the comment from Benjamin Netanyahu in the last few days about not wanting a two-state solution. Even though, as has been said, people have lost faith in the idea of the two-state solution. That is the official policy of the EU and the United States. So for Netanyahu to come out and say that publicly, I think people are worried here that the US is not using the influence that everyone knows it has on Israel effectively enough. And that's why the EU is trying to get these senior figures around the table and trying to kind of effect a bit more change.
That's really interesting. As the death toll has mounted and as this war has continued, we have seen some distinct shifts in the rhetoric from some EU leaders, Macron noticeably, the French president. Julien, are you seeing and hearing that elsewhere?
Well, I think, as Suzanne says, there's a lot of frustration and unhappiness with obviously the recent statements by Netanyahu ruling out the prospect of a Palestinian state and a political track. There's obviously immense concern about the death toll, 25,000 Palestinians killed now, but there are still huge divisions, and I don't think the Europeans are coming to a place where they're really going to push together. You have a number of states calling for a ceasefire, saying that this has to end now, but you have a number of very important states, the Germans, the Austrians, the Hungarians, who continue to block a more meaningful push against the Israelis from a European perspective. So until you don't have that unity amongst the 27, it really inhibits the ability of the EU as a whole to push forward a line here and try and work with the Americans or the Arab states to put pressure on the Israelis or on the Palestinians. Borrell is coming out very loudly at the moment. He's making some bold statements about what needs to be done and the drivers and the causes of the problem. But he very much speaks for himself as opposed for the 27. And I think that's obviously the big weakness of the European position here.
You mentioned Borrell there, and I was looking at some of his comments today. I mean, they're increasingly, the tone of that is increasingly critical of Israel. On Monday, he said, when he was talking about a two-state solution and Netanyahu's pushback on that, he said, what are the other solutions they have in mind? Make all the Palestinians leave, kill all of them? The way they are destroying Hamas is not the way to do it. They are sealing the hate for generations. I mean, that's a really, really strong statement. Suzanne, do you think we're getting some insight here into Borrell's personal views on the conflict?
Yeah, he's an interesting figure. He's the EU's top diplomat. He's Spanish. He's from a socialist background. So he has always been more on the pro-Palestinian side. He won't say that publicly, but that's the reality. It's not a surprise, really, he's coming out with those statements. But I think it does get to the problem with the EU and foreign policy. Who speaks for the EU? Because in the EU, you have all these institutions that are around me here at Brussels. You've got the European Council, you've got the EEAS, you've got the European Commission, with different people heading those institutions. So we saw Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, come out strongly at the beginning for Israel. Then we have Joseph Borrell, who's based a couple of doors down, saying something completely different. So this is the problem for the EU when it comes to foreign policy. There isn't somebody who's the President of Europe who's speaking for Europe. And now on this issue, we're seeing big divisions, I think, personally and politically, between, for example, von der Leyen, a German politician, and Borrell, a Spanish politician, from different political traditions. So that is then filtering down among member states as well. And I think that is adding to this sense of incoherence. And frankly, they are not in agreement. Germany is still on a very, very different page than Belgium, Spain and Ireland. And we saw this in the way into the meetings this morning here in Brussels, some very different statements from foreign ministers. I don't see how that's going to be resolved. If anything, this current conflict in the Middle East is just underscoring the divisions that are in the EU about this topic.
Suzanne, the divisions that you were talking about there primarily relate to the war on Gaza. And I'm wondering about whether those divisions are replicated when it comes to dealing with the Red Sea and dealing with the Houthis and the conflict in Yemen, and whether or not those are being linked. Ben, let me ask you for your take on that.
Well, Germany in particular is in an extremely difficult position. I mean, they've been treating this whole problem with kid gloves, because particularly von der Leyen, who came out and made very strong statements, but technically it falls to Borrell to make foreign policy or represent the EU as a body in foreign policy, and that she was encroaching. into his territory. And indeed, her staff, I think some 800 members of her staff complained and formally published this letter saying that she should back off. But obviously, Germany doesn't want to open itself to the charge of anti-Semitism, given the legacy of the Second World War. And so they're being very, very cautious. But as a colleague from Politico was saying, the divisions within Europe are multifold. Everyone has a different position. And like I said before, it comes back to the fact that, there is no sort of government here, that there's no unity, that any decision the EU make has to be approved by all 27 members. And so everyone has a veto on it. And so it's herding cats, basically, to get anything out. And when you have a crisis like this, and a difficult one with lots of very sensitive topics that affect directly the member states in different ways, then getting a consensus is extremely difficult. And at the end of the day, I think coming back to the military action, that Europe as a whole continues to shelter under the US security umbrella. There's been complaints on the American side that people are not paying enough. They're not meeting their 2% of GDP commitments. And again, here we are in a situation where military is called for because the Red Sea, that channel, the Suez Canal, 10% of global trade goes through there. And of course, it ends up in the Mediterranean. So for the EU, this is crucial trade, and they need to keep it open somehow. But what's happening is they're letting the Americans take the lead, and that they're now saying, look, but our interests are affected here, so we have to get involved somehow. And when we do that, we're going to try that and do that as a team. But getting the team to all, sit in the same direction is proving very difficult.
Ben, you say it's like herding cats, and all of these cats have their own different concerns at home. Julien, how much do you think these positions that we're seeing within the EU are being driven by domestic interests?
So I think specifically on the Gaza war, there's a huge amount to which we can talk about this being about domestic politics. I think the Red Sea is different, and I think actually there's probably a lot more unity on that issue domestically amongst the leaders about the need to respond and for the Europeans to step up, albeit divisions about how the dimension of military use. But on Gaza, it plays into a lot of domestic politics. I mean, Germany, Austria, it goes back to the historical legacy of the Second World War. You have states like Spain, Ireland, Belgium with a background of being close to the Palestinians. France obviously has a large population with links to the Middle East. I mean, all of these are the issues that are playing out in domestic politics. They're very much shaping the narratives and the debates and pushing different levers of pressure on leaders. And I guess we saw this to a certain extent with Macron's shift from a pro-Israeli position at the beginning towards the call for a ceasefire. So absolutely, there's a strong element of domestic politics here, and that can't be pushed aside with all the elections coming up, the European parliamentary elections. All of that is feeding into that debate.
Sure. Given the amount of domestic pressure to try to find some kind of a resolution one way or the other from all the different people and populations we're talking about in the EU, I'm wondering about how much influence the EU actually has to affect any kind of change at the moment. Julien, let me ask you about the amount of leverage you might think that the EU has, particularly with the Palestinians. They obviously send a huge amount of aid to the Palestinian Authority. Is it primarily through that, or is there a broader conversation here with other regional actors?
Well, I think there's two things. There's definitely the economic card, which is obviously Europe's traditional strength. They give a huge amount of aid to the PA, the Palestinian Authority. They're also Israel's largest trading partner. So that gives them a lot of influence and a lot of clout. But the question is, are they willing to politically deploy that? And if they were, then there would be political influence, because then there's a conversation to be had with the Arab states, with the Americans. I mean, then the Europeans would bring something to the table that they might be able to use in partnership with other states. But the European position on the Palestinian aid issue, on the Israeli issue, they're divided on both issues, and it means that no one really takes them seriously. And they certainly don't bring military might to the table, and because of the divisions amongst the 27, there's no unified political stance.
Well, given the search for relevance here, as we were talking about at the beginning, and the need for the EU to try to find some kind of coherent stance on this, let me ask you, Suzanne, do you think any kind of EU reform is likely to try to create some kind of infrastructure for there to be a more coherent foreign policy position? Is there a conversation going on around that? What would that even look like?
Yeah, there has been a conversation about this, and there always has been, about the need to, at the moment, you need unanimous agreement from all countries to agree serious issues around foreign policy. So it means one country can block things. And that's, a lot of people thought a year ago, that needed to be changed because Hungary was blocking a lot of policy on Russia and Ukraine. Now, how that would happen would be very complex because the EU have treaties and you would have to change that treaty, and that could trigger a referendum in some countries like the Netherlands, Ireland, for example, and people don't want to do that. So they're trying now to find a way within the treaties without reopening all the legal texts. There's a few little options you could do that could change the rules around this. But then I think that has again made that was an easier conversation on Russia and Ukraine when basically everyone agreed except one country. But now with the Middle East, you've got so many divisions on this that some countries won't be comfortable with the idea that this can be rammed through. They want this debate. They want to be able to restrain the EU if they don't agree with some ways it's going on the Middle East. So look, foreign policy, then apart from that, you've got the military dimension. That is very, very tricky because some people call for the European army, but some countries will not agree with that. They will say that's not the job of the EU. It's a trading bloc, and they will veto that. So yes, it's a discussion. But I think this actual divide over the Middle East has made it less likely, not more likely, that the EU is going to move towards a unified foreign policy.
Given that's the case, Ben, let me give you the last say here. Is the EU losing influence and leverage in the region, given the deep divisions that we see and that regional actors see?
I think it is. I think the EU's in trouble. That the war with Russia, and particularly cutting off the gas, the cheap gas that powered the whole of the EU, particularly Germany, which then powered everyone else, has been a huge problem. And now it's suffering economically, but politically too. I mean, it's shown itself, to be divided, to not be consistent. The whole von der Leyen thing backing Israel when other parts of the EU were backing Palestine, or at least calling for a ceasefire, has shown up to the rest of the world. The global south is looking at all of this and they're saying, well, look, you keep talking about values, but push comes to shove, you're just pursuing your interests or doing what the Americans tell you to do. And so it's been taken less seriously as a result. On the topic of reform, though, that's going to have to happen. And the issue there is if Ukraine is admitted to the EU, then a third of what the EU does is the common agricultural policy. And that's the amount of money that Ukraine will be entitled to under current rules mean the EU budget will collapse. The whole funding of the EU is going to have to be changed. And so if they're serious about letting Ukraine in, and it seems they are, then there has to be this reform, and it needs to be root and branch. Common agricultural policy needs to be done. The voting system, everyone's very unhappy with that because of the de facto veto that everyone gets, that Hungary has been exercising. So how you actually do it, because you have to have a unanimous agreement to make these changes. I don't see how it can be done. It needs to be done, but there can.
Well, it certainly sounds like it's a moment of reckoning, certainly self-reckoning, for the European Union. Ben Aris, Suzanne Lynch and Julien Barnes-Dacey, thank you so much for joining me here today on Inside Story, and thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also always join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.